if you look up what happened to him on the internet, it says that he tripped and fell while getting onto a pelican and shot himself in the head. But that's not what actually happens.
And that is the first thing on today's recording.
Oh, no. Well, it's just funny, the one guy in Noble team that doesn't like die on screen.
Yeah.
is just like, nope, yeah, I died this way.
So upcoming schedule. Don't come to class on Monday. You'll be here along with anyone else who forgot that. Yeah, building will be closed.
Oh, you're giving me my birthday.
So that's the first thing. Second thing is, this afternoon, I will be getting up some kind of study guide for an exam that will take place a week from today. I still don't really know what that looks like. I'm gonna figure it out when I get back to my office and start writing the study guide. So I'm hoping that that study guide will be useful. I will try to make it useful. It will be a list of the topics that we have covered and sometimes the kind of abstract question that I might ask. So I might state what can we say about how would we use those kinds of questions that might show up on an exam with more structure than that, but thinking about that kind of question might help you to more quickly have your thoughts together when we have the time constraint of the exam. Question?
Will there be any like Unity book-based questions or is it all lectures?
All lecture-based. So the grade outcome for everything Unity that we are doing is in those homework submissions. So that's why that has the same weight as the exams. The exams are so, I'm giving you great reason to pay attention and learn from the lectures because that will also be really important in the second part of this course. When you go to write reviews, I'm going to want you to tie the experience that you have back to a lot of the content that we are covering right now so that you can make more detailed analysis than just, it was fun because dopamine. I want you to be able to go into a little bit more detail than that, understand what about the design of the game was successful or not, so that you can give that level of feedback back to the developers of the game you're reviewing. Other questions pertaining to exam or study guide? Yeah.
The notes can then be typed.
Yes. Yeah, your 8.5 by 11 sheet of notes, you can handwrite them, you can type them. I don't care what's on it. I don't care really how you produce it. I'm not going to collect it afterwards. So whatever is useful to you. And again, I'm going to write some questions on the exam with the goal of you won't just be able to refer to the sheet and get full credit based on what's on the sheet. That may be some prerequisite knowledge to be able to answer the question where you have to think and produce your own design, your own thoughts. So you can throw things like definitions on that, but you're not going to get 100% for remembering a definition. You're going to have to know what something means to be able to apply it. So I'm not ever looking for the exact definition, exact words. There won't be multiple choice or true false. It'll all be some kind of either short answer or a longer design exercise where you're going through and showing that you can make some design decisions based on some of the material that we've covered. That's my goal at the moment. Yeah.
I just want to recap. So you said we can use it in note sheet.
Yeah.
The review will be next Thursday.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll dedicate, in most classes, I dedicate a full class to the review period, but because what we've covered is a little bit less technical, I don't need to draw out a ton of diagrams about exactly how something works. I don't know yet if it's going to take the full class. I will start the class with what questions do we have, and I will not transition back to new content until the questions run dry.
Okay. And then the exam will be the following day
Following
on
day
Friday.
on Friday. Yeah.
Review Thursday, exam Friday.
Yeah.
And then, okay, note sheet, it'll be theoretical.
Yep, it'll usually be some kind of design exercise where, yeah, you're making a game, you're starting to outline some ideas for a game. When you start to think about implementing this or making this more real while still adhering to some of the design principles that we've talked about in class. Yeah.
So are notes allowed to be double-sided?
Yes. And if you're really wanting to, and you want to double up on that, you can use different ink or pen colors and write one horizontally, one vertically, one, I don't care. Whatever you want to do, you have that sheet, whatever you want to do with it. I'm not gonna collect it, care, judge, doesn't matter.
Are we gonna have to come up with any ideas from complete scratch, from complete zero?
Possibly. I'm not gonna be judging you on how good that idea is. From scratch. You can likely make do with whatever it is that comes to mind. Or maybe I will give you a little bit of direction and say, pick one of the following genres and start to construct something that matches, who knows? I'll figure all that out as I write it, but I'll try to at least give you some structure to whatever it is so that you're not completely making everything up on the fly.
I would much prefer that.
Yeah.
Personally.
Other questions?
I'm excited to see your smoke gun. I've never had one of your tests before, so I'm curious what it's gonna be.
And this is gonna be so different from even other classes-based exams, because usually I have a lot more to tie to. There's more content that is actually I can make short answer type questions. And there's a little bit less of this here, but that still will exist. But I like, especially in game design, where the focus is on the design, I like there to be some design on the exam where you're applying. These are a bunch of theoretical ideas that we've talked about. Now, how do we actually go use them? How can they be useful as part of a design exercise? Anything else before we dive back in? All right, let's do it. Last time we were talking about, we started with the designer-centric goals. Why do designers design games? We transitioned into why do players play games? So we were starting to talk about players play games for fun. So we talked about some different types of play and how this may not be fully representative. There were some reasons that we played games that didn't easily fit into one of these categories, but this is some work that has been done historically to try to capture this. Some more recent work on player typology tries to really fully augment and try to tie this to psychology research to say, are there psychological reasons that we like the kinds of games that we like? So this is a very ongoing field, trying to understand, can we actually predict and provide recommendations that are better than just, you like this genre? Can we actually, could we use machine learning to rank games by how much we think you're going to like them based on some data? Can we make that as accurate as possible? Maybe in the back of your mind, think, what would you do to try to be able to answer that question? Because that is a very open research question. So we talked about immersion. Once participation isn't voluntary, the game's no longer a game. Yeah, so I guess we stopped in the middle of this slide. So we talked about once your attention is on something, it's easier to continue playing. We ended last class with a discussion about what can break your immersion, what can break your concentration in a game, what are all the different kinds of bugs, difficulty issues, mechanics issues that can do that. So we can talk about mechanics and narrative. Are mechanics or narrative better at long-term attention? What do we think about that? Yeah,
I think it really depends.
Yeah.
Especially upon the game you make. Some games, I'm not gonna quote John Carmack completely, but some games the story just needs to be there as a way to segue into the gameplay. And that is what keeps people coming back. Other times, the story is what's really good because of the multi-dimension and the fact that there's branching options and lots of choices.
yeah. You need a reason to continue playing. That can be mechanic, that can be narrative. The mechanics need to evolve if your mechanics are the reason that you are playing the game. Your mechanics need to unfurl, become more complex. The difficulty needs to evolve. There needs to be something new that is presented at some point that changes how you think about the mechanics, how you think about the game to continue to keep you engaged if it is a mechanics-driven game. It's easier with a narrative. the reason you're playing the game is to see what happens next. So it's a little bit easier to have more repetitive mechanics if the goal is to get through that to the next piece of story. Yeah,
So that actually makes me think of Portal and Portal 2, because Portal 1, it's mostly the mechanics. And Portal 2, the mechanics are still there, but once you play Portal 1, you pretty much got the mechanics down. But now, but now the story for Portal 2 is much more engaging than for Portal 1.
yeah, absolutely. One way to think about this would be to analyze someone who plays chess their entire lives. Do the mechanics of chess change? Does the narrative of chess change? That's intriguing to think about. Why does someone dedicate their entire lives to mastering what is a complicated game, but it's simple to represent? So both mechanic and narrative are good at long-term attention. You just have to make sure that there's some evolution to either the mechanics or the narrative. If it's the same random encounter in a Japanese RPG, for instance, then the same random encounter type at the same difficulty for a long period of time, that gets stale. Something needs to change. There needs to be a difficulty spike. You need to learn some new skills. Something needs to change for you to stay attentive for long periods of time. And having a community around or in your game is also very good for long-term retention. There will be ebbs and flows to the level of interest in your game when you make it, and working with that, you can start to find a structure for the long-term health of a game based on how that interest waxes and wanes. We can talk about fulfilling in a little bit more detail. So some reason that we play games, playing that game should fulfill one or more of those reasons. So we've talked about socialization. You can tell that I wrote these slides originally during COVID, especially during a pandemic. Socialization was especially important in some of the activities because socialization was harder. We were more isolated. So you can also dive into and think about, what is society dealing with right now? How can I tailor my game to meet the needs, the current needs of my players as they're going through whatever it is they're going through in society? I would argue that a very successful game would increase the development of socialization-based mechanics when socialization and other ways of means of life is harder. Lots of other reasons that you might choose to be fulfilled or have a way to be fulfilled in a game, but different players have very different needs when they sit down and play a game. So recognize, one, we can't satisfy everyone. There's just no way to appeal to absolutely everyone. It's better to make a game that's going to appeal to a particular demographic and do that really well, instead of trying to think about how can we address everyone's needs. That's going to be a very shallow game that doesn't have a meaningful connection to your player base. Also worth recognizing that as a player, your needs differ on a day-to-day basis, a year-to-year basis. Life changes. You get a full-time job, less time for games. Be a full-time student, less time for games. Have a full-time job and have kids, less time for games. Your family starts getting old and you need to be a caretaker, less time for games. So it doesn't mean that our needs to have fun change, but the scope that we can interface with it is different. So being able to say, I like this kind of game, how can I interface with this kind of a game as my life evolves? You can start to target some different demographics or think about different demographics who all want to play your same kind of game. Think about the different experiences that your player base might be going through. Allow a certain subset of players to be able to make progress in a 15-minute, 30-minute play session that they can do once per week, because that is how much time they have. Make some mechanics that work for someone who has all of the time in the world to play your game, but don't pit them against each other. I like to think of AI in game design or AI in the middle of a game? How could we use AI to tailor the experience of the game to the player as we are capable of understanding more about the player? So you could do something like analyze player emotions in some way, shape, or form and use a GAN to generate game content on the fly to satisfy the player's needs. That's an intriguing direction of the future of AI in game design, if we could get something that worked at a level that was actually fun. That will exist eventually. Not yet. We talked about the concept of a illusory attitude, a willingness to play games, or the desire to play games. So you need to have that attitude in order to engage with that game. So the goal of a player may be, I want to explore my desire to play games. So the goal of a player with a illusory attitude is to follow the rules and win the game, or make progress in the game. You are a cheater, you want to win the game by any means necessary, not constrained by the rules. A spoil sport doesn't want to win the game and may or may not want to follow the rules. They just want to make everyone around them as miserable as possible. So of course, we want to make it as easy as possible for people to have that attitude when they play your game. So you can do this by respecting your player, trying to understand who is my player base, who are each of these kinds of people. They're taking time out of their day, out of their busy schedule to interface with your game. Try to respect the reasons they are playing your game and give them a reason to continue to come back. That requires that you know your demographics. You need to know who is playing your game. What constraints do they have? How do you want to design your future content around continuing to engage them? They aren't going to be necessarily you or anyone on your design team. So getting a representative sample of people who are going to play test your game. Bring in the older dad who has kids and a full-time job. Have them play your game. Bring in, I don't know, a young woman in college who has a full-time job on the side and ask them about their experience. Try to find a wide variety of people who may be interested in your game and make sure that that is part of your testing process and development. Flow is an incredibly important concept. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it because it's very abstract and it changes depending on a lot of variables. So the definition of flow here is going to be the state of optimal challenge. This means what is the perfect level of difficulty for your game and for the person who's currently playing it based on their current skill level. So players have different ability levels between different players, but even the same player at different periods of time. When you're first playing your first game in a particular genre and you're in the tutorial, you have a very different level of ability than you do when you're playing your 20th game in that genre and you're in the tutorial or you're at the final boss. So how do you code for all of these different skill levels, all of these different abilities? So if you err on one side, a game that is too difficult is frustrating. You will get people who quit your game because it is too challenging for them right now. A game that is too easy is frequently boring. If you're not being challenged, then it feels like the game could play itself. What is the point of my being here if I don't really have to think or do anything for the game to progress itself? You can visualize this as a diagram that has two axes. We have the challenge level and the player's current skill level. And both of these work well together. So if the skill level is high and the challenge level is low, we get boredom. If the challenge is high and the skill is low, we get frustration. There is a band in the middle of this that we're going to call the flow zone that a player can be in. That means that they will continue to play your game. The best place to be within that flow is closer to the boredom side than the frustration side. And the reason is the emotion that that evokes in a player is that I am powerful, I am skillful, I am overcoming this challenge and I am darn good at it. That's a very powerful feeling when you're playing a game. And so designing for this over time is incredibly challenging. Again, each player is going to have a different amount of skill, and that is going to evolve over time. That skill is going to go up. So finding a way for your game to figure out what is the skill level of my player. You can either do this in terms of difficulty settings, let the player choose the associated difficulty that matches their current skill level. If that starts to become incorrect, they've become more skillful, they can modify the difficulty again. You can use adaptive difficulty, collect some data on how is the player engaging with your game. Based on the data that you collect, you can, underneath the hood, change the difficulty of the game to do the best that you can do to modify the difficulty to be in this green flow zone where they feel skillful and powerful. Yeah,
It kind of reminded me of this very similar difficulty graph where they
yeah.
have the mindless fun and hardcore fun bands at the.
Yeah, it's very similar to it's exactly that concept. And different players do want to be in different parts of this flow. But ideally, your difficulty this is the easy difficulty, this is the hard difficulty. You don't actually want your easy difficulty to be in here too much. You don't want your hard difficulty to be in here. The entire easy to hard should be within that flow. Intriguing that different players may want to be at different places in that flow at different times as well. A boss fight should maybe feel a little bit more here than here. Whereas the everyday encounters that you might have, the everyday enemy and every minute enemy that you're fighting probably should feel closer to here than here. How do you get that data? How do you know how to set that difficulty? Any thoughts from a design perspective about what you would do or how you would go about collecting that? What's the relevant information to consider? Yeah. Definitely play testing. So you'll have some data from someone playing your game and you could design surveys, you could take notes on their experiences, but that's also, you change some numbers based on that feedback. Maybe you invite 10 people, you change some numbers. You better get those people back or get some new people in because the game is now different. Maybe what they thought they needed isn't actually what they needed when they come back to play the game a second time. So play testing is super important. But it's also expensive and time consuming. What can we do that might be a little bit more accessible to you as the developer what else could we collect? Yeah.
I mean, as well as just designing it around the mechanics in mind and the limits. It's that you set on your game. If you make it, is you can very easily pigeonhole people into failing simply by an oversight of a design.
Yeah.
Or you could pigeonhole them to using a very simple, easy exploit.
Yeah.
You need that optimal ability to allow for not only player skill, but also some form of handicap if you're not as skilled.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
If you wanted to do something more like adaptable in real time, you could keep track of like how many times the player has died in a certain amount of time, or like how often they get hit, and then kind of have like a heat system, right? So like if you as a player go into a level and you start taking a lot of damage, your heat builds up, but instead of like throwing more at you, you start throwing maybe a little bit less. Like as a developer, I think it'd be your responsibility to kind of mask it so it doesn't feel like the game is holding your hand. But like you can ease off on the heat without like making the player feel like you're like coddling them.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it. The player doesn't want to know. I'm so bad at this that the game is changing to make it easier on me. You can build that directly into the experience the user is having. Maybe when they hit this particular area, we're going to spawn between 1 and 4 enemies for them to fight based on something. And then what they experience is dynamic based on how they performed leading up to that. Yeah.
Just to kind of expand on that, there are some games that I have played where like I'm like still getting the hang of it, and I've died like a number of times in a row. And then the game, like after you die and it's like game over or whatever, a little pop-up pops up and it's like, hey, we noticed you really suck at this. Do you want to like maybe go down in difficulty? So it's like you're not getting as frustrated and angry, and it's like, no, I wasn't frustrated and angry, but now I am.
Easy mode,
Yeah.
not selectable.
That's an important design decision, right? How straightforward do you want to be with your player? Do you want to be doing it underneath the hood without their permission? Do you want to ask their permission? How do you ask their permission? Maybe you could allow them to opt into an adaptive difficulty or not, and if they don't have the adaptive difficulty, then that's something that they know about at that point.
Yeah, last thing.
Yeah.
I think it's important to also have like a bunch of difficulty settings accessible to a player through like an accessibility setting or like a difficulty setting.
Yeah,
Like I've seen some games where it's like, there's like all these mechanics that you have to worry about, and then, but then they will actually let you adjust those parameters, like how many seconds of invincibility do you want when you're dodging? Like how much health do you want the enemies have? How do you want to scale their damage? How do you want to scale your damage to them? Like so on and so forth, like. And that gives players like a sense of agency where they can just really dial in the experience that they want.
Does that ever take away from the immersion factor if you're dealing with a particular story? Do you feel like if you adjust the difficulty sliders, you're supposed to be this character going through this event or going through some, I can see how a player might say, this makes it more like a fake engagement because I have so much control over what I'm doing, that I do agree that most of the time that's a good idea, but there will be some players who don't want to touch that, want to go through a default case, and the fact that the developer let them have that level of control feels immersion breaking. So there's two sides to that, I think, but it is very important to consider that when you make a final decision about exactly what you want to do for the game. Yeah.
Like a good option is to have side quests or optional things that you can do that are much harder.
Either, opt into the difficulty, or it becomes the way to grind to get past something that is a roadblock. If this is a roadblock, rather than making the roadblock easy, you could say, go grind some levels doing these side quests. When you come back to this encounter, you will be stronger. Maybe if it's level-based, you can replay some levels, gain additional currency, gain additional resources of some kind, use those to improve your character, and now you have control. But without it being in the options menu, now you feel like it's your character who is making the decision to prepare adequately for this fight, knowing that it's going to be difficult. And now it's from the lens of the character or through the eyes of the character that can feel a little bit less immersion breaking.
It's also the inverse case, just to be devil's advocate here. They grind way too much, and now the entire game is a cakewalk because they just outstat everything.
Right. So in that case, you need some kind of balance curve that says early grinding that you do does not affect the difficulty at the end. You have to make that decision consistently throughout the game for each one of those important difficult fights. And that way your past decisions aren't affecting your current decisions in more ways than you intended, or that the game communicated clearly to you.
But that can be really frustrating too, because if I go up a level and gain plus 5% damage, but all my enemies gain plus 5% health, then it just feels like the game's handing out these increasing numbers without them actually meaning anything.
I still want to go back and burn Oblivion for that reason. If the game is scaling with you to try to increase the difficulty as you go along, it makes it feel like, what's the point? Why am I doing this? At least hide that behind some other systems, scale the enemy's health, not based on level, but based on progression. And it makes it feel like there's a new challenge to overcome, not because I engaged with the game, now everything is harder. That makes no sense
I think it's,
to me.
I think it should be a statement said that more health does not equal more difficult enemy, it just equals spongier enemy.
That too.
And it's a really fine song and dance trying to balance that, because that is really annoying in Oblivion, that I'm level 50 and suddenly the bandit's trying to rob me when he has ebony armor.
How did he get that?
What?
Has he been trailing me and picking up all the gear I left behind?
I mean, I don't know
He's
how.
stalking me, hasn't he?
I don't know how. I sold it all to the blacksmith.
The more you drop and just leave stuff behind, the more this guy just goes and gathers.
Yeah,
more.
if
That's
you
a
quickly
great
move the
idea.
camera, you see some NPC hiding behind a tree.
And yet he's still demanding 100 gold from me. Versus at this point, it's drop everything.
Yeah.
That would have felt a little bit more immersive, is I have this armor, give me everything you have, because I can't actually completely end you.
Last point, and we should probably move on.
That was kind of my point when Cyberpunk 2077 yesterday, it was, I went to try to level up elsewhere and I came back and had pretty much the same exact experience, it was, no matter what I did, that quest was the same difficulty, despite the fact that I leveled up, try to
Right.
make things easier with that.
Player agency is a very important concept, and all of this relates to the concept of player agency, which is just what options do the players have? Make all of those options feel meaningful in some capacity. Make those decisions change the outcome for how it feels to play the game. Next, desire players can have structured conflict. I don't like violence at all in the real world. It can be pretty darn fun in video games sometimes. Allows you to just take out some frustration that you would never want to take out on a person with feelings. You don't want to make someone feel bad, but there's something pent up. I need to take this out on something. Take it out on some virtual bits. So an example of a quote: chess players' desire is not for general abstract intellectual activity, but a particular kind of intellectual activity whose channel is the rules of chess. We see this also in animals, and unfortunately, they don't have video games to go take out their pent-up frustration on, so we get wonderful nature documentaries. So, but we also see that there are limitations about what is acceptable within the societal understanding. So puppies play with each other. It can get pretty aggressive at times, but there's still a limit to that play. When does play become not play? So you can build a game around team conflict, can be traditional sport-based, any online team-based game. So making any kind of player versus player or team versus team, make that channel what people are looking for in structured conflict. I swear that game design and psychology are so interlinked that by understanding human needs, you can start to target those needs in your games. And that can be very lucrative for you. If you can find a way for people to do something they want to do or need to do, but don't have the avenue to do in their everyday lives. We get empowerment. Our everyday lives can be kind of boring. But the day-to-day, there's not much there that makes you feel all the time like, I'm special. You're 1 in 8 billion humans on one of many, many, many planets surrounding many stars in one of many galaxies. It's a little bit hard to think about when you want to feel like my life has meaning. You go play a game and suddenly that avatar has meaning. The fact that you're controlling this. So empowerment can absolutely be part of this, but it doesn't just have to be feeling powerful. It could also be, I have a voice when in my everyday life, people don't take me seriously. So being able to be taken seriously in a game-based setting can be very useful. So contrast with flow. Flow wants to make the player feel powerful. Empowerment gives the player power over their choices. So 2 outcomes, we can call one autotelic. Player forms their own goals. Player goes to achieve their own goals. So player choice helps with this. Whenever a player is presented with choice, now we have the ability to choose this or that based on what I want from my own goals. I can now choose in the game what I want. Performative is a way of getting better and better and better at a game to the point where now I can say, I am a top 10% player in this game. I'm a top 1% player in this game. So as you get better at it, there are metrics or ways to measure your performance in the game. Thinking of that as art. We think about playing an instrument as an art or artistic. So how would being good at a game be any different? They're both skill-based that require a ton of practice, But once you become good at that, the act of playing the game skillfully is art. So game genres like real-time strategy games are important for this. Fighting games, you can be world renowned for that. Any online competitive game is good for that. Any game with a ladder or that is time-based. Being good at some aspect of a game is art. Players can play games to make interesting decisions. So we can break this down into some additional components. So we want a decision, an interesting decision needs to be discernible. This means the player needs to be able to tell that the game understood what they wanted to get out of that decision. So we've talked a little bit about dialogue options and making sure that the game understood what I intended when I selected that dialogue option. And what happens after that dialogue happens should reflect what I intended when I selected it. Immediate feedback. When you make that decision, you don't want the game to sit on that decision for 20 minutes and then come back to you with the result of that decision. You need some way of knowing I made this decision, it affected the game in some way. That doesn't mean it can't come back in 20 minutes. It can't come back in the sequel like it does in Mass Effect, but there needs to be something in the dialogue or in the characters who are talking to each other, something that says, I understood what you just said, and it changes something immediately. So it can also be integrated. It needs to have some effect on the long-term outcome of the game. You don't just want to make a decision that affects the very next line of dialogue and then it's gone. That's not an interesting decision. That's just a decision you have to make. An interesting decision does have long-term consequences. Needs to be ambiguous, meaning that we can have an idea of what the result of this choice might be, but not full knowledge of exactly what's going to happen when I choose this. That makes the decision interesting. If you have full knowledge, you can do enough optimization ahead of time to the point where there's a right answer and a wrong answer. That's not interesting. An interesting decision means that there's a reason to choose all of these. Which one is best for you right now, how you want to play the game. An interesting decision is double-edged. There's upsides and downsides to a decision. There's some trade-off that you are making. Even the downside can be, I don't get the reward of what I didn't pick. That is a downside. It needs to be novel. It can't be part of a decision that they've made before, especially a decision that they've just made in the recent past. So a game that's all about dialogue options that change exactly the same thing, prescribed in exactly the same way. The first one is interesting. The second one is slightly interesting. The third and beyond is obnoxious. So change up the kinds of decisions that people are making so that it's fresh. Needs to be clear. So ambiguity, which we just talked about, is useful, but you need some clarity of what the outcome of the decision is going to be. The player should have some idea of this is what it's going to affect and how it's going to affect it. Even if it's not exactly what happens, they need to make an informed decision. If you give players way too many options, there is certainly decision paralysis. Just open up the Path of Exile skill tree for the first time and you will get decision paralysis. Sometimes that's okay. It's what the game is designed around. Sometimes it's not. In general, if you're trying to appeal to a wider audience, you don't want there to be too many options. You don't want your players sitting and thinking about the decision they have to make for more than probably 10 or 15 seconds. If it's beyond that, then it becomes planning, not an in-game decision that you are making. Maybe you could make a game surrounding planning for the game, but you want to abstract it from the flow of the actual gameplay. If the outcome is unclear, players can feel disconnected from the game, from the avatar they are playing. So it's very important to think about all of the player decisions that you incorporate into your game. If we don't know how significant the choice is, How would you like to respond to this particular dialogue option? You can respond yes or no to a kind of unclear question. I answered yes. The person you're talking to gets shot. You didn't see it coming. It's shocking you. Wait, I didn't mean to say that. There's a level of clarity that is missing between what the game presented to you and the outcome of that decision. So you need to know if something is life or death. They should know that going into the decision. If you make your decisions, your player decisions more interesting, your game can change. The mechanics now feel like they hit harder. They're more meaningful because of the decisions that you make surrounding that. Something like an action RPG, the decisions you make surrounding your character change how the game feels to play. You're changing the difficulty by the decisions that you make. So now all of the mechanics of that real-time combat now feel more fluid or more meaningful based on the decisions that you've made and the decisions that the designers have allowed the player to make. If the mechanics have that long-term appeal because of the decisions, then you become more involved with the game over a longer period of time. Food for thought. How do our games incorporate those decisions and choice? You could think about how those affect the gameplay that you enjoy, and then think about, would you change anything? Could you come up with a system that would allow for more interesting decisions when you don't experience those interesting decisions in a game that you are playing? So I like to take a little bit of time to talk about it, but I think we probably need to move a little bit faster. So feel free to think about this on your own time over the weekend. It's an intriguing thought experiment. We can go to experiential understanding. So this is the desire for players to experience. You want to design something, or the players want to experience something that they don't have real life experience with. If I join the armed forces and go off into a live battle, it feels very different from playing a game about this, but maybe that's something that I want to experience. I just don't want to put my life on the line, or I don't have investment in any current ongoing conflict. I don't care to be a part of that. I would still like to experience the thrill of being in that situation, but I don't want to experience the potential downsides of being in that situation. Here's an example that is very different from that. So Minichi, game made by a transgender woman named Bryce, and player takes on the role of her experience. You will role play going out to coffee with a friend. It's coded to have some decisions to make you experience what would it be like to live through the lens of a transgender person. So you start with decisions. How do you dress? How do you present yourself? How even something as simple as taking a bite of food can be perceived differently when someone may misgender you. Someone may judge you based on even the simplest little things. It's not something that you or I might understand in that moment, but the fact that that exists in a game environment where you can experience the consequences through the eyes of someone else's experience is empowering to create, but it's also empowering to experience. It allows you to help you to understand these people around me who are not me. What experiences are they going through? How can I interface with that in a way that is comfortable to them, is normal to them, and is respectful to them? Each decision in this game changes how some, but not all NPCs around this react to what she's doing. So the goal of this design was that you, the player, now feel complicit in how Maddie Bryce is treated in this situation. Things that to others may seem like a simple decision. Should I pay with cash or with a card? Is different when you hand a card with a first name that may not represent you, may not represent how you present yourself. That could be something that feels like a risk in that situation that other people don't really even consider. when they do that. It's just, again, helping you to be able to understand other perspectives. And this seems like the best way, the best type of media to go get this kind of attention out there, because you can actually role play it. You're not watching it, you're not watching someone else. If you were to watch a film of this, you would feel complicit in how someone else was treated, but you wouldn't feel like the decisions that you made had that effect. It was the decision that someone else made. And that's the difference between what film can do and what games can do, is you really take ownership over the experience that you are emulating. So, in my personal opinion, one of the most interesting goals that designers can seek to achieve is to speak to players who want some kind of experiential understanding, to experience something that they can't experience or don't want to experience with real life consequences. So, quick summary: designers make games for reasons, players play games for reasons. There's no necessary best way that I can say to go about it, but keeping all of this in mind when you go through a design process allows you to make a better game that will better respect your players' time, increase the revenue you get, increase your renown as a designer. So thinking about all of this is a very important part of the design process. It's not just about the code. It's not just about the technology or the mechanics. It's a free-flowing system that people interface with, and it's who that person is that you are, that's what you're designing, is the experience for that person. Way more to game design than first meets the eye. Any last minute thoughts on any of this, or just how this all works together? All right, we will, with the very last couple minutes, transition to at least introducing the next concept. So we're going to transition to start talking about prototyping. So you have an idea. We've gone through this brainstorming task. We have some ideas of games that we would like to make. How do we actually start going from an idea and producing some mechanics? How do we start the process of making a game out of this? So we're going to talk about paper prototyping, and then next week, hopefully before the exam, we'll see exactly how this goes, but I have ordered the trading cards. They're supposed to arrive today so that we can start to play around with this imbalanced trading card game. So we're going to apply the concept of prototyping into, all right, we have an idea for a game. I'm going to prescribe the first game. Here are the rules. Here are the cards. Let's start prototyping it out, testing it, trying to figure out what's wrong and working through it. Throughout this course, and really for the remaining portion after prototyping and testing, the rest of this is all going to be about iterating and balancing. How can we take a concept, learn about how that feels, make changes, intelligent changes that will slowly optimize this game's level of fun, engagement, monetization. What are we thinking about underneath the hood? So real quick, some benefits of paper prototypes. Because a lot of us are focused on digital games, it's tempting to just hop in front of a computer and start implementing the game world. It turns out that there are a lot of decisions that you can discern before you start writing code that would really affect how that code is going to come together. What is even the design of this digital technology? That will change based on iteration. So rather than start pigeonholing yourself into some design decisions, or some of those decisions get scrapped partway through, it's easiest to set up, even if it's a digital game, how can we set this up in paper or on paper to feel and to understand how it plays? So starting next week, we're going to dive into an example of this using Valkyria Chronicles turn-based system. How could we emulate the concept And you don't have to have played or know anything about Valkyria Chronicles. But yeah, we're going to think about, all right, we want to create a game based like this. What can we do on paper to understand how this plays before we write a single line of code? So that's where we're transitioning to. At the same time, we're going to be opening up this trading card game and starting to get some practice with that. That's where we're headed next week. I'm gonna go back to my office and make a study guide.
Thank
Have a good long weekend. Get some rest and relaxation in there. Chapters 4 to 6 are due Sunday, but honestly, I can probably make it Monday. No one's gonna grade it. So if it's a day late, don't worry about it.
You've been doing,